For the next 2 minutes, turn and share with someone next to you. Describe someone who you think has courage. What makes them courageous? Now, let your partner share. Are you ready? Shh, quiet please. We're about to start. Now let's take a look back at our story so far. The Bible is a sacred story, echoed to us from the ancients. An epic, revealing the great Creator's pursuit of wholeness for all of creation. May we find ourselves in this amazing story. During the time of the judges, tragedy struck Naomi, an Israelite woman. Her husband and both of her grown sons had died. But her daughter-in-law, Ruth, clung to Naomi and vowed to take care of her. Because they were poor, Ruth gathered leftover grain for food. The field owner, Boaz, was a wealthy relative of Naomi. He thanked Ruth for caring for Naomi and gave her grain and water. When Naomi heard about this, she sent Ruth to meet with Boaz. That night, Ruth snuck into where Boaz was sleeping and laid down by him. Later, Boaz awoke, startled. Ruth told him, "Cover me with your blanket, for you are my family redeemer." This was symbolic. Ruth was asking him to marry her. Boaz was surprised and excited. He thought she would seek out a younger man. Soon, Boaz and Ruth were married and started a family. Years later, one of their descendants would become a king of Israel. The Israelites ignored the warnings that human kings are controlling and greedy, and insisted that they have a king like other nations had. So God chose Saul to be their king, a tall and handsome warrior who defeated Israel's enemies on every side. But Saul treated his people harshly and ignored God's ways. So God secretly chose David, a young shepherd boy, to be the next king. But his time to be king wouldn't come until years later. Meanwhile, King Saul was overcome with anger and madness. Musicians tried to soothe his mind. One of them was David. Saul grew to love David and made him a trusted servant. Saul's son became David's best friend. Then David married Saul's daughter. Before long, David was made commander of Israel's armies, and the people sang songs about his greatness. This made Saul angry and jealous. So the next time David played music for him, Saul hurled a spear at him. David dodged the spear and ran away. In his madness, King Saul sent soldiers to kill David, but David escaped and hid in a cave. There, David poured out his heart to God through music called psalms. Before long, Saul was killed in battle, and David was made king. David deeply loved God, but he wasn't perfect. Once, David had an affair with his general's wife. To cover it up, David left the general stranded in battle, and he was killed. But David turned his heart back to God and tried to lead the people in following God's ways. Later in his life, David's son, Absalom, became very popular with the Israelites. He stirred up a revolt and drove David out of the kingdom. Then, Absalom and his soldiers chased after David, but David's soldiers fought back. During the battle, Absalom's hair got caught in a tree, and he was killed by David's general against David's orders. David was overwhelmed with grief, but returned home to lead Israel again. He was king for many years and was loved by God and all the people. David passed on his throne to his son, Solomon. Solomon prayed, asking God to give him wisdom to lead the people the right way. So, God filled Solomon with great knowledge in many areas. He wrote numerous proverbs, poems, and songs. And people traveled from faraway lands just to learn from his remarkable wisdom. Solomon built a magnificent temple as a permanent home for God in the center of their land. This massive structure was built with the finest materials in the world. Fire flashed from above as God's presence entered the temple in a thick cloud. Solomon became the most wise and prosperous king in Israel's history. But over time, Solomon married foreign wives who turned him away from God. He built shrines to false gods and treated the people of Israel like his slaves. God warned Solomon that the kingdom would soon be torn away from him and divided. Despite this warning, Solomon became even more wicked. Not long after Solomon's reign, a civil war broke out, dividing the people into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And God inspired messengers called prophets to challenge the widespread hypocrisy and corruption in these kingdoms. The prophet Elijah challenged Ahab, an evil king of Israel, saying, "Call on your God, then I'll call on mine. Whichever God sends fire, that's the one true God." All day, Ahab's prophets shouted to their god Baal to send fire, but nothing happened. Then Elijah called out, "God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, show us that you're the true God." Fire flashed from the sky, burning up the altar and the ground that surrounded it. The people of Israel called out, "The Lord is the only God." Not long after that, Elijah was carried into the clouds by chariots and horses made of fire. But Israel and Judah returned to their selfish ways, worshiping idols and neglecting the poor. and other nations conquered both kingdoms. People from the kingdom of Israel were never heard from again. The people of Judah were taken captive by the Babylonians, who burned the magnificent temple to the ground. Even in captivity, these exiles held on to the hope that God would someday restore their kingdom. In our next story, God works in remarkable ways in the midst of exile. Let's continue this story right now.